All right. So we're going to talk about properties in math. Sometimes you need a better understanding of what those properties are to move on with your equations that you're going to do in pre-algebra and algebra. So we're going to talk about them real quick. Uh, shouldn't take that long. So here we go. Commutative property. Order does not matter with addition or multiplication. And right now I have the addition examples. 5 plus 4 is the same as 4 plus 5. They're in the same community, they just switched neighbors. Right? You think of your neighborhood and you live next door, and all of a sudden you decided to switch houses. So you're kind of switching places in this. So 7x plus 3 is exactly the same thing as 3 plus 7x. 9x plus 4y is exactly the same thing as 4y plus 9x. You see the gist of it now? Negative 1 plus 3y squared is the same as equals to 3y squared minus 1. These are the multiplication examples of commutative property. 6 times 2, same thing as 2 times 6. They're in the same community, they switched neighborhoods. They switched houses with one another, right? 5x times 3 is the same as 3 times 5x. Negative 7y times 8z is the same as 8z times negative 7y. 1/2 x squared times 10 is the same thing as 10 times 1/2 x squared. All right, next one. Associative property. Associative property, grouping does not matter when adding and multiplying. You could switch the grouping. You could switch the parentheses. They haven't changed number places. They've just changed parenthesis places. And when you see them with parentheses and they're adding, they're addition examples. So, associative property of addition is what I should say. 5 plus, and then parenthesis 4 plus 2 with a parenthesis is the same thing, but they just switched the grouping around, and they said with the parentheses 5 plus 4, and then plus 2. And then 6 plus x plus 7, and they have their parentheses around the x plus 7, but you could easily do 6 plus x plus 7, and just switch the parentheses around. And there are 2 more examples here, and I'm not going to say them again to you, so you can read them. And then next one would be the multiplication ones. Multiplication examples. Negative 7 times 2 times 7. And then they switched the parentheses around and did 2 times 7 times negative 6. Same answer. Just the parentheses are switched between them. Next up. Identity property. Identity property is when you keep the value of the number. So 6 plus 0 is 6, and negative 2 plus 0 is negative 2, and 11x plus 0 is 11x, and 3xy squared plus 0 is 3xy squared. So the identity property of addition would have zeros in it, and you would know an example if you needed to answer that question on the test of what property this is, and they have 6 plus 0 equals 6, then you know it's the addition one. It has an addition sign, it has a 0, and it's the identity property of addition. The identity property of multiplication is when they would use a multiplication, but they use a 1 instead of a 0. And it is the same value of the number that it's multiplying it with. Anything times 1 is itself. Negative 5 times 1 is negative 5. 9 times 1 is 9. And so on and so forth. And you see how that's written. Next up are the inverse properties. Now this is a property that you're going to use quite often in pre-algebra, algebra, algebra 2, because you're going to need to know the inverse operation of solving an equation. And we have an example. So it cancels it out. It cancels it out. When you're doing the inverse property, you're doing the opposite is what I normally call it. So if 5, then you're going to subtract 5 and you're going to get 0. It cancels it out. 6 minus 6x is 0, the inverse. The inverse of the multiplication is flipping it around. This is multiplying. Multiplying You're going to flip it. It's called the reciprocal. But most people know it is just flipping it around. 6, then you flip it and you multiply it with 1/6, it's going to equal 1. And 1 over 9x, you just multiply it with 9x because you know you're flipping it. And then it would equal 1. Why? Because 9x divided by 9x equals 1. That's where that comes from. And then the next property you're going to use is the property of 0. That one's pretty easy because you should learn that like in elementary time with your multiplications. Anything multiplied with a 0 is a 0. Not really going to go into that too deep, right? Because this is what you should already know. Anything multiplied by a 0 is a 0. Next up, distributive property. This is also an important property. You're going to see a lot of this in the algebra world. And you would have multiplying a value to an expression in parentheses. Basically, I tell them, in other words, this is Mrs. Saul's theory, rules, whatever you want to call it. Multiplying what's on the outside by multiplying with each term on the inside of that parentheses. So this is 3 times x plus 7. See the parentheses? And you're going to take your little arrows and point to each term because sometimes people leave this one by itself and think it's just 7. But it's really 3 times x and 3 times 7, which would be 3x plus 21. You want to multiply with what's on the outside of the parentheses with what's on the inside of the parentheses. And that's very important to know. To multiply it with both terms, or however many terms are in that parenthesis, that's how many times you got to multiply that 3 with, or whatever number or value they give you out there. So, I gave you an example. I gave you a few examples, and I didn't really label them, so we'll label this one A, and we'll label this one B, and we'll label this one C. And so you'll see. Now, this one looks a little lengthy. It looks all kind of all squished, but it's a half times 8x minus 2 equals 4x minus 1. And so you would do a half. This would be the answer. That would be the answer. I'm sorry. My bad. You're not solving it yet. You're just doing a half times 8x minus 2. And then I wrote down the steps of how you would get the 4x minus 1. And I have a half times 8x and a half times negative 2 because you're multiplying it with each term inside the parentheses. You put the 8x over 1 and the negative 2 over 1 and you multiply it. You get 8x over 2, which is 4x. And you get negative 2 over positive 2, which is a negative 1. And then over here, these are the answers. And you would distribute the negative 2a with the 3b, and negative 2a times the negative 5. If you needed to see what that looked like, that would be your next step if you're not used to doing these kind of problems. I kind of do this in my head, so I don't really think about it. My bad. Negative 2a times 3b is negative 6ab. And negative 2a times negative 5 is 10a. You also have to know your integer rules also, because negative times a negative is a negative times a positive is a negative. So you really have to know those details of this problem. And then again, we have negative x into times 7. And then you have negative x times 2x. And then this answer is what you would get. Negative 7x. Now, the coefficient, the number always comes before the variable. You can't say negative x7. You could, but that's not how they're going to give it to you on the paper. They're on the test. They're going to give it to you negative 7x. And then negative x times 2x, well, you would have to know your exponent rules for the product rule. And that is negative x times 2x would be a negative 2x squared. All right, I think that follows. Oh no, I know what I wanted to do. I have some practice on here. So For you out there in YouTube world, you're going to need to pause and you're going to write this down on a piece of paper, and then I'm going to write the answers up. So take a moment, write it down, and then see if you can name the property of each one. And what I'll do on my part is I will put it in blue so you'll know and I'll know what I'm doing here. Okay, so I have 8 of these all together. So these are the first 4. On the first slide here, I was able to get 4 of them. So we have distributive property. Why? Because you're distributing what's on the outside with what's on the inside, and that's 3 times x plus 3 times 4. And so that would be distributive property. Next one. This is 9 minus m times 0. That would be the property of 0. All right. Next one is 5 times x plus 4, x plus 4 times 5. They switched the houses, right? They switched places. They switched places. So that would be what? The commutative property. Commutative. And the next one we have parentheses. And they kept all the numbers in order, but they switched parentheses. They switched the grouping of them. And that would be the associative property. Hopefully you said that out loud and you knew that answer. Alright, so now I have the next 4. We have 5y times 1 equals 5y. That's the identity property. And that would be a multiplication if they wrote that, but identity property. And sorry about the nasty D there. And then the next thing we have x times y times 8, y times x times 8. They have, well, they made that a little confusing. They switched the x and the y, kept the parentheses, didn't move the parentheses, so it's not associative. So that means they switched places. That means it would be commutative property. And it would be of multiplication if they really got technical about it. And you have to, what? Pay attention to the details, because they really didn't switch the 8 around. They didn't switch the parentheses around. They switched what was in the parentheses around. And then name the inverse of negative 18. Well, that would be just positive 18. And name the inverse of 2/5. Well, then that would just be 5/2. So you flip them, or you do the opposite. And they do have it as additive inverse, and they have it as multiplicative inverse. But if you just do the inverse of each one, then you should get the right answer. And that concludes this session. So go back, rewind, look at it, take notes, and thank you. Take care.